From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good evening, everybody. I think we'll go ahead and get started. I don't like to get started too late. My name is Leslie Johnston, and I'm the acting director of the National Digital Information Infrastructure and Preservation Program here at the Library of Congress. And I am happy to welcome you and thank you for joining us tonight at the Rosenzweig Forum on Technology and the Humanities. The forum is a collaboration between the Center for History and New Media at George Mason University, the Center for New Designs in Learning and Scholarship at Georgetown University, and the Maryland Institute for Technology in the Humanities at the University of Maryland. Tonight's very exciting discussion topic is preserving and interpreting born digital collections. You'll be hearing about how some of our national cultural heritage institutions are addressing the acquisition and the preservation of some of their born digital collections, as well as the perspective of a scholar and researcher using these unique collections. The forum is named in honor of Roy Rosenzweig. Roy was the Mark and Barbara Freed Professor of History and New Media at George Mason University, where he also headed the Center for History and New Media. Among his other accomplishments as the founder and the director of CHNM, he was involved in a number of different digital history projects, including websites on U.S. history, historical thinking, the French Revolution, the history of science and technology, world history, and the September 11th attacks. He won a posthumous award from Wikimedia France recently for an essay he wrote in 2006, Can History Be Open Source? Wikipedia and the Future of the Past. So we're thrilled to be co-hosting the forum tonight as one of the special events in celebration of the American Library Association's Preservation Week 2013. And someone asked if there was a hashtag, and it's PRESWK, Pres Week. There's no hashtag for this event, but there is one for Preservation Week. So if you're tweeting, please go ahead and use that. This is an initiative that is supported by the Library of Congress and elects the Association for Library Collections and Technical Services in ALA, the Institute of Library and Museum Services, the American Institute for Conservation, the Society of American Archivists, and Heritage Preservation. Preservation Week is an event that encourages libraries and other collections to connect to our local and regional communities and inspire action to preserve our collective heritage across all of our institutions. We're having a number of events here at the library this week. We started today, we're going through Friday. We're very excited about this sort of events and that we got to co-sponsor this event tonight in particular. So a special focus this year is on saving the mementos of military members and their families. So before we launch into the speakers, I would like to take this opportunity to introduce Monica Mohindra, the Library of Congress Veterans History Project, because she'd like to share some information today with you about the project. So Monica.
Good evening, everyone. I'm short and I move around a lot, and those of you who heard me earlier will remember that I said that. So if you can't hear me, you just need to wave, and if you can't see me, duck around and I'll try to duck to see you. Before we get to this really exciting topic, and one that we're also very interested in the Veterans History Project, I'm going to give you a sales pitch. I assume all of you are here because you're working with these kinds of materials and objectives, and we need your help. How many of you have heard of the Veterans History Project? Oh, be still my beating heart. That's really fantastic. Okay, well, I'll go really fast because then you know some of the basics, but hopefully I can dispel a couple of myths and encourage you to work with renewed passion with us. So the Veterans History Project was started in October of 2000, and the idea was actually, believe it or not, legislated through unanimous legislation in Congress. Sometimes we joke it was the last unanimous legislation in Congress, signed into law by President Bill Clinton, and went into effect essentially, 6 months later we started collecting actual items. What we collect, the focus is, of course, oral histories, but we also want first-person experiences that are told through that first-person narrative that get to that same feeling. So collections of letters, documents, photographs, those kinds of materials, journals, diaries. And on our website, which is /vets off of LOC. On our website, I'll show you in just a quick minute how to get to exactly what our scope is. For you, the pitch I want you to understand is that the legislation was written in such a way that individuals would interview the veterans in their lives and their communities and submit those materials to the Library of Congress. So I give this talk a lot. I do it in 5-minute, 10-minute, hour, 2-hour increments. I do it for people all over the country. I do it for students. I do it for laureates. It doesn't really matter who I do it for. What happens when I do this is people start seeing the veteran that they're connected to, and Aunt Millie and Uncle Bob and their cousin, and they stop listening right about when I say what we want. And so at the end, however long I have talked, somebody invariably comes up to me and says, what you really need to do is come interview Aunt Millie. I need you to come interview Aunt Millie because Aunt Millie was a whack and she has all this great stuff to tell you. I'm one person, and we need you because we don't have a cadre of oral historians flanking the country going to get these stories. So we particularly need people who are working with organizations to get the stories of the veterans in your communities, because we need, to borrow a tortured phrase from the Librarian of Congress, we need multiplier effects. We need people who can help spread the word. Why do we need those people? At the moment, we get between 100 and 150 collections per week, voluntarily submitted. That's amazing. What does that add up to? We have about 86,000 individual collections currently, also a number we're very proud of. Guess what? 86,000, 22 million. That's the universe of veterans. And so we start with World War I. We have about 200 collections, and we go through the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, of which we have about 1,000 collections. 60% of our collections are World War II, and with apologies to the white male population in the room, 60% of those are enlisted white gentlemen. So we need the broad spectrum of stories so that we can tell the full story of American conflict, and we need your help to particularly reach underserved collections, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, women, people of differing faiths, backgrounds, etc. So my point here tonight, and what's so exciting to us, is this is a unique opportunity with a special focus on military service members and their families and people who are reaching out to work with them. Is we're talking to people about how to preserve items born digital, how to preserve items for personal use, how to preserve items with small institutions, with large institutions. My message for everyone who's participating in this week is consider the Veterans History Project for the military person in your family as a repository for the original materials. And then do all the other exciting stuff that you're going to do for your family members and for your locality. And so just a couple of quick things on the website, and then I'll get out of your hair. But I want you all to now start thinking about that veteran or 2 or 3 that you're going to be working with to get to the Library of Congress. So on our website, what you'll see are a few things that are really important for you to pay attention to. One is how to participate. This is a great little area to learn all kinds of things, including learn more about what we collect. This is, within the next couple months, going to be updated, but the scope is still the same. That gives you this information here. And then this is the part that's going to be updated a little bit, what we accept, but you can pay attention to this for now. And then working backwards to our homepage, the other thing to know about is this wonderful area up here is where our 15-minute video is. It requires real player, which is annoying. So we also have it on iTunes U and on YouTube. And you can find helpful information like that on our RSS feed, which I highly recommend everybody subscribes to. Look at this, we're celebrating Preservation Week. But if you go through here, you find all kinds of really fantastic tips and things that are happening in this universe. So this is our feature this week, which we're really excited to share. And one thing that is a myth that a lot of people don't know is that we do accept these first-person narratives that come in a form of this experience without necessarily being an oral history. That's important for deceased veterans. It's important for people who can't tell their first-person story for a variety of reasons. We do not take proxy or secondhand interview, so it has to be the original materials. People say, why originals? Well, I think I don't have to persuade all of you. I think many of you probably understand why originals. But just one quick story. This gentleman here, John Carpenter, is one of my favorites because his family sent us his diary from World War I and later thanked us for existing, which we thought was kind of sweet. And then we found out why. The diary was kept in a hall closet with the family Bible in a special box with all these other special, handprints and baby shoes and all those things we all hold dear. And then Hurricane Rita came by and swept that entire closet and that whole first floor wet. So if they hadn't turned in the originals to us and taken nice digital copies for family members, it would no longer exist. I like to tell these dire stories because they pull at our heartstrings and make us think about, yes, the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress. So that's a really great series of collections that you get a quick sense of who we are. And my colleague at the very back, Rachel Telford, helped to put this together. So if you have questions for her as the evening ends or winds down, she's the person to ask about this. So that's pretty much it. This is the database, so you know how to access some of our information about some of our 86,000 individual collections, over 13,000 of which have been digitized, and we hope for more of that. And then this is the last in our series about Vietnam, but we have 39 of these total Experiencing War features, another great way to thematically introduce yourself to our collections. I have to let go of the stage now for somebody else to speak more substantively about tonight's topic. But before I do, I think I could probably take 2 questions. None? Great. Thanks for your time, and think about that veteran and, get in touch. Appreciate it.
Thank you so very, very much, Monica. I'd like to introduce our first speakers who are coming to us from the Smithsonian Institution Archives. Riccardo Ferrante is an information technology archivist and the director of the Smithsonian Institution Archives Electronic Records Program. He oversees digital preservation there and digitization and their electronic records management activities. I'm also welcoming Lynda Schmitz Fuhrig, who is the electronic records archivist who handles everything from word processing files to born digital audio, video, and the Smithsonian websites that are in the archives collections. Welcome, Rick and Lynda.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for coming out this evening. First of all, a little background about us. We're kind of a mystery to some folks. Some people think we're part of the National Archives. They're a little confused about the role of the Smithsonian Institution Archives. And actually, there are 16 special collections, libraries, and archives at the Smithsonian. This includes the Smithsonian Libraries, Archives of American Gardens, Archives of American Art, the National Air and Space Museum Archives, and so on. We were formally established in 1891, so we are the institutional memory and official record keeper of the Smithsonian. The Electronic Records Program was formally established in 2003, but we were taking in electronic records prior to then, and so obviously we are concerned about the digital history of the institution. The photo you see here is the collection of a zoo researcher, and this documents many decades of her work. In addition to all the paper that we have in this succession, we also have 3 decades of computing as well. So we have everything that you could think of in terms of born digital and electronic records. We have text and audio, CAD drawings. Everything comes to us in a variety of ways. We have about 500 collections now with electronic records in them. Some of them are a mix of paper and born digital, and then some are strictly born digital, such as email collections and websites. And we get this material to us on removable media, such as hard drives, 5 1/4 floppies still come our way, 3.5-inch diskettes. We're starting to get some Blu-ray now, as well as jump drives. We do FTP transfers, server transfer, and then we'll occasionally get some email attachments as well. And some of this information that we get, anything you can think of. We have exhibit files that include photos of various exhibits. We have museum memos. We have CAD drawings from the National Museum of the American Indian. And then we also have Anna, the forensic anthropologist from Natural History, who has her very own Facebook page. So some of our best practices include inspecting the media, if it comes to us on removable media, before we do any work with it. We conduct virus scans on all our material. We take in the material and we ingest that with checksums to ensure the integrity and authenticity of the files. We also do another source copy, so this is how we can do our preservation work. We do keep the media as well, and we do analysis of the files that come to us using tools such as Jove and Droid to determine formats and any issues that we may have with these files. And if we have proprietary files, which we tend to get a lot of, we will work to convert those into more stable open formats as soon as we can. One of our management tools is a MySQL database. This gives us a more granular level to track what we're doing with our electronic records. We're able to determine how much we're getting in every year, how far we are in the preservation track with these records, as well as determining how many WordPerfect files we have, how many image files we have, and so on. These are some of our current preservation formats. So anything that's a word processing format, we'll want to get that into PDF-A or PDF. We do the same with PowerPoint and Excel when possible. Images, we'd like to have those in uncompressed TIFF. Access databases, we're using something from the Swiss archives called SIARD XML. We've had good success with our access databases. It's also supposed to work with Oracle and MySQL, but we haven't had as much luck with those. CAD has been very tricky for us. We've done some research into this. We were able to convert some of them into PDF, going from DWG to PDF, but there are issues with losing various layers when you do the conversion. So we're tending to rely on CAD viewers now for that. Audio goes into broadcast wave. Our websites are crawled and captured as WARC, which is an archival web container format. Email, which I'll get into a little more later on, but that's saved as an XML preservation format. And born digital video is not straightforward at all. And our toolkit includes quite a bit. We use both open source and proprietary software. I've mentioned Jove and Droid already. We use FITS a little bit as well, which is another tool from Harvard. But keep in mind, FITS is also a format that's used by the astronomy community as well as the Vatican. There's also Media Info, which is a good tool for AV files. And we have some of our own in-house batch scripts that we use to run on our files. We use Bagot. Yay! As well as the NARA file analyzer. Jacksum is a checksum tool. TerraCopy is another tool that helps us copy over files. QuickView Plus is a piece of software that's gaining a lot of attention in our field. People are using this as a viewer. And then the RipStation, which helps us actually get content off our CDs and DVDs in a much faster way. So some of the more difficult collections that we do have are ones that contain older, possibly unknown formats dating back 20 years or so. Social media and websites. Social media tend to be very tricky. We're dealing with third-party vendors. They're constantly changing what they're doing on the front end and back end. They're pretty hard to crawl. And then there's also the whole can of worms with their terms of service. Email, we'll discuss in a little bit. Video, we are now making disc images of DVDs that come to us so we can retain the playback and chapter functionality of those. And I've talked about CAD already a little bit. So some of the older files that we've been dealing with, we have something called Gerber, and these are actually files that describe images of printed circuit boards. And we do have some of these from the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory. And I can't show you those because they're actually in a restricted collection, but here's what they should look like. And actually, part of what we do in the archives is research and try to find out what these old formats are and what solutions may be out there. And we did find a tool called GerbView, and we're actually able to convert them into PDF. PCD is the Kodak Photo CD. This dates back to '92. When we were all still using film and taking that in to get developed. At some point, in the 90s and 2000s, we were able to get a CD as well with your digital images on there. Photoshop used to have a plugin that would work with Photo CD, and it no longer does. So again, doing some research, we found IrfanView, which is a free tool that could convert these files into TIFF, because otherwise they're unreadable. Executables, some of them will still work, other ones don't execute anymore, so we need to do some DOS emulator research into this area. This is what I like to call our files in disguise. Again, we have many word processing files, and some of them have no extension. They have weird extensions. I know Leslie recently blogged about this. They'll have .mem, .lbl for memo and label, or it might be .doc, and it actually really is a Word Perfect file and not a Microsoft Word file. But again, we'll run our scripts, see if Jove, Droid, anything else can figure out what they are. Sometimes they can, sometimes they can't. But we are able to sometimes open up these files in Notepad and actually view the various coding. Here you'll see the WPCN, which means this is actually a WordPerfect file. If it was a Microsoft Word file, there should be coding toward the bottom of the file saying Microsoft. It would say MS Word and then what version it is. But you can also use hex editors to see the hexadecimal and figure out what the file signature is and determine from there what it might be. But we're still getting these files in as well. It doesn't stop. I recently had a file that had .powerpoint on it, and it actually turned out to be a TIFF file. And again, we have other files that have come to us maybe 15 years ago. We did the bit level preservation on them, and we still haven't been able to figure out what they are yet. But we're going to go ahead and keep them and keep working at them. On the other end of the spectrum, when we get to the actual preservation, here's a straightforward word processing file. It's Microsoft Word. It's a cover letter from one of our units. It's using our standard letterhead at the Smithsonian. We went ahead and used Acrobat to put it into PDF-A, which is PDF archival. I think everybody in here knows that. And then when you actually run pre-flight on it, it comes back and tells you, no. The problem here is with the font, actually. It's Minion Regular, which is a font that cannot be embedded due to copyright issues, but Minion Pro can be embedded, but I'm not going to be able to convince the entire institution to change their letterhead. But this is something we know about, and we've documented it, and we're aware of it. Getting into the issue of email account preservation. For those of you who don't know, we did a 3-year email preservation project with the Rockefeller Archive Center. We developed a preservation schema. We co-developed that with the MCAP project, which was another email preservation project with North Carolina State Archives, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania. We had also developed a parsing tool as part of that project, and we still use these tools today, and we're still very happy with what we had done with the project. At the time, the largest account that came to us was 1.5 gigs, and it had 89,000 messages. And now we're starting to run into issues with scale. The largest account we have right now is about 26 gig. It's 208,000 emails, very attachment heavy. So it's kind of getting up on the edge of what our tools can do. And we're encountering issues with corrupt files coming to us as well, and things breaking with the PST files that we're seeing too. But the point being that, you know, digital preservation is a continual process, and we have to keep working at it and keep looking for tools and know that some things will be getting better. And at this point, I'm going to turn over to Rick. And here we go. Yep.
The email illustration is wonderful because it really gives me a launching point. This is my segment, Getting From Mine to Ours. And when the electronic records program started in 2003, our focus was very much on capturing that piece of history that was slipping away, the born digital records. And did a great job of that. Our focus has been very much on capturing that and preserving that and getting it out of those kind of really risky situations. Most of what we got was part of a mixed media accession, and we only had one copy, right? So you have to go through all those best practices to make sure that it doesn't disappear. The end result of that is we were basically, as far as electronic records were concerned, we were a dark archive. Transitioning from the dark to the light has been full of, as you see, issues. So we have a number of ways to get at our information. One is the collection search on our website. And then we have a couple of others that are really kind of the focal points right now. One is the Smithsonian's Archives catalog, where we participate with the other archival units at the Smithsonian. And we call that SIRIS, stands for Smithsonian Institution Research Information System. And then we've been involved with the Natural History Museum, their botany department, in a clear-funded project to expose hidden fieldbook collections, various scientists' fieldbooks that they've collected over the past 150 years that haven't been accessible online because there was no cataloging repository for that. The Fieldbook Project is doing that through the Smithsonian's Collection Search Center, and we have 7,000 plus titles currently cataloged there. And so that is, again, another slice on the material that we have. Here's where we begin to see the rub. So it's great to have lots of different ways to see the material. On the back end, we have a number of different repositories that we have to deal with for our digital assets. Electronic records is big and green. That's because that's the largest set of born digital material that we have. We have a little over 250,000 born digital records at this point in time, and we typically take in a little bit over 40,000 a year. So every year the archives adds to its collections overall by about 300 and 350, and a good third of those at this point in time contain born digital media. Digitized collection material, our history on that has been, as people need it, we'll do what they're asking for, right? So that might be a photocopy of a page. Then we realized, oh, you do that over and over and over again, it's going to have an impact on that material. So we started making better choices about that. Again, it was very on-demand driven and not a whole lot of critical mass to it. We've since switched to a more project driven, and then we take those reference requests to trigger a focus on a given project. And that is overlapping with the Smithsonian Central Digital Asset Management System, which is based on Artesia. And here's where you get into the internal politics, because so much of going from dark to light is about negotiating relationships. And every organization this is such an organic process. But as the Smithsonian Dams got started, it was funded with discretionary funds from 4 different units. Their metadata model didn't really exist, as everybody had their fields and they kind of were all in a flat model. And as there became more substance and support to that, to make that rigor, to integrate that into what was there, they started limiting what went in. So right now, the centralized dam supports images and audio and video. So it's a limited set of formats. Now, there are great reasons in terms of building a system and getting it out in a federated environment like the Smithsonian, but that impacts the choices we have to make with regards to using that system. Our digitized collection material is largely image, audio, and video. So that works. That's why you see the overlap there. Electronic records, our approach to that is an archival information package, and I'm now going to refer to them as AIPs because that's so much easier. We take a whole accession and treat that as an archival information package. If I have to then pull that apart to be able to put the images and the audio and the video and leave the CAD and the databases and the textual documents and the websites and social media in a different repository, that just becomes a nightmare to manage. So what we've done has been working with our digitized material and storing that in the dams, not 100%, but we're working towards that because that's kind of late to the game. The electronic records have been largely dark, and now we'll move on as we begin to solve this solution. As we're dealing with all this, so you have context now, we found that process and ownership as we try and drive this to the light is bluntly said a turf war, which if you want to throw a positive spin on it, it's a great way to identify where the gaps are, okay, and then bring those parties together to help resolve those gaps. So technically the issues really come into what do we call it? I want to call it this, I want to call it that. Do we stick with the file names that they came in with? If we don't, is there sufficient justification for doing that? How do we document that? What does that do to all the things that we care about in terms of authenticity and completeness and et cetera? Or do we do that with access masters that we create for this and work from there? Storage and disaster recovery then get encompassed. So what we have found ourselves quickly pushed into is this idea of digital curation. So we're not just dealing with our born digital material, but the digitized material, because we want to keep that for a long period of time, we need to apply the same sensibilities to the care for that material, which is great. And the dark info system, the MySQL database that Lynda referred to, is a way of providing that curatorial management for both sets of material. We've also kind of organized our groups inside the institution archives so that the digitization team, the electronic records program, and then the web and new media outreach team all fall under digital services, which is really, really good. And makes coordination a lot easier. The acquisitions team are the folks who actually do the cataloging. They do A&D for us. And they are the owners of the finding aids. They also produce MARC records, and the cataloging group also produces MODS records for the Fieldbook Registry. So this is part of the dialogue. When we had a conversation earlier today about, as we begin to push out enhancing our finding aids, how do we communicate back and forth? And who gets to make the decisions about how those finding aids are annotated? So the important thing is those conversations are being made, and we're keeping that final decision and ownership in one place. So we went for low-hanging fruit. Here's an example of our finding aid, sliced and diced, so you can see what the header is. And it's kind of faint here, but you'll see underneath the folder names that we've been able to use the Digital Archival Object tag, the DAO tag in EAD, to put that information and that access object right there into the finding aid. So as they're going through, they don't have to go somewhere else to get to it. They can pop up, look at that really closely. These are actually watercolor illustrations of Egyptian, they're ground bees or bee flies. I'm not the scientist, so I don't know. But these are hand-drawn watercolor illustrations, amazing amount of detail. And this is what we can deliver off the web. So yeah, it's fun. We also are doing audio, and here is one of our secretaries who also did a lot of work in Panama collecting. And so we have some of his oral history clips on here, as well as PDFs of the transcripts of that material. And then we also have video. Again, all embedded so that they can experience this right in the context of the finding aid. And so as we've now got that capability, the next thing is how do we push out in a massive push the digital material that we have. And this is where we get into the challenges of working with PowerPoint 2010 and displaying it PowerPoint 2007. Low-hanging fruit is great, but we can't stop there. And that's, I think in terms of organizational dynamics, that's the hardest thing to do, is to think in a more abstract sense, further out on the horizon. It's very easy to see, to the end of the block. But that approach has been a limitation for us in terms of dealing with scale. And when a given accession from the Smithsonian Channels, who's the group that puts together the programs that appear on the Smithsonian Channel on your cable, they'll come in and Lynda's just like, we get a given accession from them may have over 200 proposed DVD programs. So that's a lot to take in, and that's just one of 150 accessions during the course of the year. How do we push that out? How do we manage that? So this is why I'm saying here it requires a sustained commitment and tolerance for a level of abstraction that you haven't had before. You're looking a little bit further down the road. Research is key, and that's what we found as we have worked with folks coming in from various programs, including George Mason and University of Michigan and GW and UMD, is we're tackling the issues of what is behind the issues with CAD. And it turns out that the latest version of CAD is actually layers, and you have to have multiple files in order to have the complete CAD drawing. We have to dig into that, doing an assessment of all the born digital video and figuring out whether or not we have all the codecs, right? That becomes part of what we do, and that's the research that has to be done. What are those tools available to do that? And it means that we also have to play nice with our service providers. You saw the picture about the centralized dam system. It's really easy to focus on what they can't do for us or aren't willing to do for us. But that's not productive on either side. So we really have to look at the positives and look at how to help them accomplish their agenda so that they will help us accomplish ours. Building for engagement. Clearly, the way that we're approaching our finding aids are all about taking that information and making it accessible. But we're also pushing out in terms of engaging communities through Facebook, through Flickr. We're also involved in something called History Pin, if you've experienced that. But it's a way of getting people involved. Our blog pulls from the same source and provides the same metadata along with this material, and then also links back to the finding aids or other resources on our website. Again, this is cycle around, cycle around, cycle around. The next places that we are headed with this is crowdsourcing. So those scientific field books with the wonderful handwriting that nobody knows how to read because we're not taught that in school anymore, needs to be transcribed, but there are communities of interest. We don't have the staff to transcribe those. We don't have the money to hire people to transcribe those, but we have communities who are very interested in a particular topic. We can tell them that it's there. You guys have heard about the New York Public Menus thing. That's a different thing. That's a general interest. Collecting field books for birds in South America is a smaller group, but deeper. And so how do we get to them? Virtual reading rooms and applying digital humanities tools to doing research with this material now that it's in a digitized and what I call a semi-permeable form. People are able to get past the surface. Email preservation is kind of where I'm going to wrap up here. And the issue with this is we did what I feel is a stellar job. Of course, I have a stake in that. Okay, disclaimer. Figuring out how to capture a whole account in a single XML file, leaving you the choice to embed your attachments or not, capturing the structure of how that user organized their material and all the nested threads, but being able to deliver that to a researcher without requiring them to have a fairly good grasp of XML and be able to read raw XML is a place where we fall short. The funding ended at the point of being able to preserve it. The next step is providing that front end that gives a user-friendly view and something meaningful. Obviously, when we have a CIO who has departed, it left us 15 gig of email, 250,000 messages. Browsing through that is not an effective way to approach that material. So a couple of things that we've seen and explored and are very excited about is Muse, and the next generation of Muse is ePad. We involved Peter Chan from Stanford was out recently as we are kind of working with them on this next stage. And we pulled in our chief reference archivist to go through this demo that he did for us. And she has been very hesitant to encourage people to look at email as part of a person's correspondence just because it's so difficult to approach. And as she saw the different ways that these tools, one, let you visualize trends, let you modify a lexicon with which to approach this, her eyes just lit up. She was very excited about being able to now offer this to researchers as they dig into this material. So things are coming. It's a concentrated push. You just have to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. But at the end of the day, you got to start with facts, not a gut feeling, not hearsay. And so we began in 2003 to do physical inventories of all of our digital media and what was on it. And Leslie, yell at me if I'm over.
You're about to go over.
Okay. Last year we did the first phase of a pan-institutional Born Digital Collections Holdings survey where we looked at 7 different archival units. We've had at the archives a 10-year program at this point in time come September, focusing specifically and formally on Born Digital material. The other ones had not. So we had a good grasp of what we had and the condition it was in. They didn't know where it was. They didn't know what it was. They didn't know what collection it was in. However, as we went through this and did actually find the bulk of everything, almost everybody, the predominant type of media was optical discs. The only other thing that really kind of popped up was 5 1/4-inch diskettes, which largely were us and the National Anthropological Archives, because of how they get their material, and in reasonably good condition. So at that point in time, Leslie's cutting me off, and I respect Leslie and don't want to ever make Leslie mad, so.
Wow, I didn't know I had that much.
She does. She really does. And for good reason. Is there time for Q&A? Questions?
Could you say more about what you envision as a virtual reading room?
Our goal behind a virtual reading room is being able to have available environments where we can pull in digitized and born digital material for a researcher to work on, to build their own data projects and products, but not be able to take out of that environment our records, right? So you want them to be able to take their data products with them, but not to be able to take our material out. And to do it in a way where it's timed, right? So we put a keyed access to it, and we give them the key, and it times out in a period of time, unless they ask for it to be renewed, right? And so when that key expires, that environment gets wiped away. But the drag and drop capability for our reference staff to be able to quickly set those up is really key. That environment really is great if we can allow the researchers to bring their tools to that, so that they can really do things like doing natural language analysis of that material and so on. Great, thanks.
I need to talk to you about that virtual reading room system, because that's something I think I could use. I'm very pleased to introduce Bertram Lyons. Bert is a colleague here at the Library of Congress who is a certified archivist working in our American Folklife Center, working with our digital assets in the Folklife Center. And I'm going to cut short my introduction because I want to give Bert time to talk.
Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here to talk about one of the American Folklife Center's oldest born digital collections. Seems to get a lot of airplay in the public from StoryCorps and through NPR, but I don't think it gets a lot of airplay in the archives world in terms of what the collection is, what it looks like. But I'm going to focus specifically on how we acquire the collection and what steps we are taking to make sure the collection survives into the future as a valuable resource for researchers of all types. First, however, I'll talk a little bit about the reference model, which thanks, Rick, for going ahead and talking about that first, because it's never like to be the first person to bring up OAIs. This particular model, as I think many people know, is not something that's necessarily a guiding workflow, but it does kind of talk about functions, and it's really important for a lot of the terminology that I'm going to use today, and that Rick also broke the seal on. But then in the second half of the presentation, I'll use the StoryCorps collection as an example of this model in action. I'm going to give, first of all, because I'm an archivist and I like context, I'm going to give 2 points of context before I jump into this. First is keep in mind that the StoryCorps collection is only one of 3,000 collections in the American Folklife Center. The American Folklife Center archive has been around since the 1920s. It's home to more than 3 million photographs, manuscripts, sound recordings, moving images. And it's all of this documentation is of traditional and expressive culture from around the globe. From the earliest field recordings made in the 1890s on wax cylinders to contemporary digital oral histories made just yesterday for the Civil Rights History Project. Also, I should say that the Folklife Center itself is only one of many collecting divisions within the Library of Congress. I'm speaking here today for the Folklife Center. As a second point of context, I want to note that the Folklife Center's collections management program is an emerging one, and this echoes some of what Rick was saying a second ago. Although we've been creating digital collections since 2002 and acquiring them, it really wasn't until 2009 that we began to develop systematic processes for the acquisition, for the creation, and for the preservation of digital content, and to align those processes with those throughout the Library of Congress, as well as those throughout the general cultural heritage community. To give you a sense of scope, last year the Folklife Center acquired 77,927 digital objects for our collections. 60,720 were born digital acquisitions, which we consider our unique collection material. And you can see here that we've created also 10,000 plus preservation masters of original analog or other digital objects, and about 7,000 just general reference copies that we're making available online or for researchers in our reading room. Of these assets, real quickly, just to also kind of give you the scope, you can see here just under 35,000 were manuscripts, 24,000 still images, 17,000 sound recordings, and about 2,000 moving images. So as is the case with many cultural heritage institutions, we're getting better at the Folklife Center at acquiring digital content, at being able to tell you what we acquired, when we got it, where we put it, whether it's undergone any changes. Because at the heart of our concerns, I would say that being an organization that holds collections in the public trust, we want to be able to say 10 years or 100 years from now that here's the resource that we acquired, and it hasn't changed over the years, or if it has changed, this is how it's changed, and this is why it's changed. All right, wrong direction. All right. Our general workflows are based here in the OAIS model, which everybody loves. These circles here, the SIP, the AIP, the DIP, are really some of the for me the most important parts of the model that we take away in our practice. Looking at how digital content is coming to us, what's happening when it gets here, and how it's being used to be made available to others. The SIP, the Submission Information Package, represents for us content as it arrives, as we prepare to move it into the library's environment. The AIP, the Archival Information Package, is a way that we talk about representing content as it's stabilized and as it's documented and organized by library servers, on library servers for long-term storage. The DIP is something that we're not quite using yet, but I mean, we see ourselves moving into that particular area where that represents how content is then prepared for access into the future. All of these different instances, and I like the way Rick mentioned this because this is how we've been building our systems, are representations of content in some state. They're not necessarily one-to-one relationships. One SIP doesn't have to equal one AIP, which doesn't have to equal one DIP, because we do exactly the same. We see the AIP, the Archival Information Package, as all the content related to one given collection in our collections, and multiple SIPs can come in to create that one AIP in some iterative process. I'll talk about that here shortly. These 6 boxes, ingest, data management, access, archival storage, administration, preservation, planning. These are more various about functions. These are about functions, and I'm going to use these real quickly to talk a little bit about the Folklife Center's workflow before I look at StoryCorps. At ingest, what we mean by ingest and what we think about with ingest is this active acquisition and the act of accepting physical control over the content. When we can, we work with donors to provide checksums and manifests for the files upon delivery, and when we can't, we create those kinds of security measures, those kinds of inventories for the content upon receipt here at the Folklife Center. It's during this ingest phase, ingest function, that we're preparing an SIP for storage as an AIP and for future access. Data management is something that is really at the heart of our work in terms of knowing what we have, knowing what we're doing with what we have. It gives us these abilities to understand where we're moving, where we're putting content into the library servers, what we may need to do with it in the future. At this point, we collect information about objects at a file level and at an aggregate level. As you can see, in order to be able to generate the stats I was just showing, we track our holdings on arrival at item level, and we extract a minimal amount of information from each of the objects. We're also at this point able to apply characterization to the files that only a human could provide. Because not every bit of information that you might want to keep about it, and I'm not talking about descriptive, about a file can be extracted from it. For instance, questions like, is this an original, unique, born digital object, or is it a digital representation of some other digital object, or is it a digital representation of some analog object? It's often necessary to have some kind of human interaction to get this information. I'm sure we've all experienced seeing hundreds, thousands of files without any way of understanding the difference between what was the source of a file. You can imagine over years it's going to be very difficult for us to understand about these files. So anyway, we work really hard to do this. After we generate item level information in this data management stage, we're also documenting the aggregates, these SIPs, into our own Folklife Center digital inventory database, so we can track this SIP as we move it into the library's environment. And lucky for us, we also benefit from our colleagues here at the library who've built larger inventory systems. One is specifically called the Content Transfer Services System, which has been a huge help to us here in the collecting divisions. It's kind of a misnomer, the Content Transfer Services at this point. Services is really important. But this is a user interface to a system here at the library that helps us all kind of track the, as it says, the inventory of our collections. What do we have? What are we doing? And as we're moving, and to help us move the collections around on the servers and perform certain services, certain functions, certain things like characterization with Jove, other kinds of analysis that we might want to use. All right, I'm boring myself right now. I'm sorry. I'm much better with questions. If you can just jump to questions here. I'm going to try to go a little quicker here. Archival Storage, we lean entirely on the knowledge of our library. Luckily, again, we're at the Library of Congress, and myself, I don't have any control over the IT infrastructure here. But I do get to work with colleagues here at the library and learn from them and make use of their expertise. So we store all of our digital collections on tape, linear tape here at the library. Or not everybody, but we store our what we consider our archival collections on linear tape, which are both redundant and distributed. And then I'm going to quickly run through here. Administration, you know what that is. And I would say that our weakest links here are preservation, not here at the Library of Congress, but in the Folklife Center, are preservation planning and access. These are things that we're working on. We feel really, really strong with our ability to ingest content, to manage the information about that content, know where it's stored, to work with all of that. But we are now at the point where we're looking forward to preservation planning, thinking about format obsolescence, and moving even further into thinking about what's the best way to make our collections accessible. We're really good at giving you access one at a time. If you come into the reading room, we can get you to the digital content that we have, but we're starting to push further where we think about data sets that we have that we can make available to researchers, or instead of 1 or 2 or 15 objects, how about a batch of 15,000 objects? How do we get to that point? That's what we're thinking of now in the Folklife Centers. All right, so StoryCorps. I promised I'd talk about this. I'm going to give you a quick overview. For those who don't know, this project is a national project actually based in Brooklyn, New York. It was created by Dave Isay in 2003, and it's modeled actually after the Works Progress Administration of the 1930s, through which oral histories with everyday Americans across the country were recorded. Many of those collections are also here at the library. Each interview in this collection is usually around 40 minutes. The interviews are conducted usually by friends and family members of the interviewees, and they are almost always accompanied with photographs and manuscripts. I'll show you a little bit about that here in a second. StoryCorps does provide some access to these collections online through their website, but usually it's a one-at-a-time kind of thing, and it's more curated, specially chosen collection, or especially chosen interviews that they want to highlight for any given moment. We've had a relationship with StoryCorps since 2004 at the American Folklife Center, and we've been collecting the content from StoryCorps every year since then. Early on in the relationship, StoryCorps would send CDs to us. They would send Microsoft Access databases. They would send hard drives, but they would usually only do this once a year, and they would batch all of that up into one big package and send it to us, and we would work our way through it. Over the past 3 years, though, we've been working with them to try to kind of make those deliveries smaller by making the frequency of those deliveries more frequent, I suppose, which has been good for us, actually, and good for them in terms of controlling and being more accurate with our work. I'll give you a quick overview of the collection itself. There's 389,114 files currently in this collection. Those digital files represent about 46,134 interviews, and this collection itself is about 16 terabytes in size. If you break it down by resource, you can see the manuscripts are by far the biggest group, 202,000 plus manuscripts in the collection. You can see in sound recordings only about 47,000. One measly moving image. I have no idea where that came from, but it's there. But it's kind of an important point that I'm starting to realize is if you were to look at this by file size, you see a very different picture, which is that digital. The sound recordings are making up the clear majority of bits in this collection. Those 200,000 plus manuscripts seem like nothing. And that's really important to think about in terms of collections management. I mean, this is a big issue. Working with audiovisual collections is really, as we all talk about how scared we are of born digital video and things like this. I mean, it's really a lot because of the size. If we just had a lot of different file formats over the size of a manuscript, it wouldn't be so scary, I don't think, to us.
Gigabytes.
Those are gigabytes. Yes, sir. Dr. Fleischhauer. All right, so what does the digital stewardship look like for the StoryCorps collection here at the Folklife Center? Well, it's created entirely by StoryCorps employees. And it's only made up of unique interviews. This is not a typical kind of archives collection. This is very much a hand-created collection by the StoryCorps organization. Each interview itself usually consists of about one sound recording, a few still images, and manuscripts. For instance, here is a quick rundown of all the files related to one given interview. You might see them on the server, rendered for human consumption. This is about what you get for a given StoryCorps interview. The documentation that you see there, we usually get three types. At the top you have the logs, in the middle there are the release forms, and then a demographic survey for each of the participants in the interview. Every 2 or 3 months at this point, StoryCorps employees aggregate those interviews into SIPs of less than 100 gigabytes each and deliver those to the AFC via hard drives. Usually we get about 10 to 15 SIPs on a given hard drive. We receive those hard drives, check the manifests, verify all the files. Sometimes, as maybe many people have encountered, different file systems like Mac file systems versus PC file systems have create or inject certain problems with text, which will often make it impossible to verify the manifests in these different SIPs. So anyway, we do a little bit of work here, processing as content shows up. Afterwards, we extract all the item level metadata that we need. We create aggregate level metadata, and we prepare this for ingest. Take the drives down to the ITS division here in the Madison building, actually, and plug them into some special computers, at which point we can copy that content to staging locations on LC servers. We use then the CTS database, the Library Central Inventory System, to move the collections to where we want them to go. Every collection that we have has a final resting home on a particular tape storage related to that particular collection, and as those SIPs land there in that particular directory, we unpack them to create the AIPs for the given collection. At which point, well, if you remember correctly, there was the AIP I was talking about, and the AIP is added to CTS and inventoried as a whole. So there's the big process that we do. And let me move on a little bit here. As I mentioned in this title that this is a holistic process, and what I was thinking about when I wrote that was that early in our relationship with StoryCorps, they were giving us databases, Microsoft Access databases that all the different booths around the country were sending into them, and we were for years, every year, trying to recreate that database and use it internally in our reading room. But the minute that we got that database recreated, it was already out of date. StoryCorps is continually, it's a living, breathing institution. They're creating new interviews every day. They're updating their own databases every day. So what we've been trying to do these days is to think a little bit more creatively about our relationship with them, and to think about what it might mean to be the archive for a living organization. And in that sense, we've now changed our strategy with them, and to the man, I'm stuttering. Sorry. We've changed our strategy in working with StoryCorps to allow them to do their work, and for us not to do redundant work in order to provide access in our own research, or for our own researchers. So StoryCorps brought all of their databases into one central location now, and instead of us mounting our own database, we take exports every 3 months from their database, as well as the code that supports this Drupal website, to serve now as a dark archive for their own services here. In return, they let our archive staff and our reference staff access their databases, which are web accessible and password protected, in order to provide access or do research within the database that our staff would want to do. And for us, that's become a pretty, it's taken some of the load off of our own workflows, but it's also allowed us to serve as more of a living archive for our StoryCorps colleagues. So I'll end by saying we hope that using these bit preservation collections management strategies and with a holistic approach to collection development, we hope that we can provide long-term access to the interviews created by StoryCorps for current and future research needs. And we also really invite you all to come visit and explore the collection. It's open to the public, and you're welcome to use it whenever. Thanks. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yes, Deb.
How consistent is the data that the StoryCorps provides you per collection? Is it all exactly the same stuff? Named the same way, same components?
Yes. You mean the files? The
Yeah.
file? It's definitely 100% consistent. Yes.
For formats such as StoryCorps or other storytelling formats, or any kind of oral history, are these edited interviews, or is it the whole?
No, these are the raw interviews. Sometimes, actually, in some of them, we do get a couple takes if there is a bad take. This is everything. And when interviews are redacted from the collection, even if they've already been here, we move them out. But often StoryCorps keeps everything, and then they just note in their data that the content was redacted by the interviewee or interviewer or somebody. Sorry. Okay.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
How do they
From them to us?
Yeah.
They put them on usually terabyte drives. On average, every 3 months, I get 2 terabyte drives from them, and those might have 10 to 15 bags on them of content. They bag them in little 100 gigabyte size bags, which make it easier for me to put those bags into the system. Instead of having to work with a terabyte at a time, I work with chunks. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit about how you correlate that information on a story for a central database with the stuff was this done into your archive structure the way you have?
What's the relate?
The dots?
You see that interview ID on the far left here? That DDD0139 SFB00. That interview ID is standard for StoryCorps. The first 3 letters represent one of their initiatives, and then the number is a one-up number. Every file that shows up in the system, every file that shows up to us has these IDs to them. That's really the connector to everything. So I can go and extract all of those IDs out of the file, out of these files. And at any time, I could go and extract all of the data out of their database and make those connections, make a join based on any of those unique files. Yeah. Does that answer your question at all? Yeah, that's the big one. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bert. Our final speaker tonight is Kari Kraus, who is an assistant professor in the College of Information Studies and the Department of English at the University of Maryland. Kari's very well known to us, having been the co-PI on a grant for preserving virtual worlds, PI on a digital humanities internship grant from IMLS, and pretty much everything else that we're interested in at the Library of Congress. So I will cut that short to give Kari time to talk.
So thanks for having me tonight, and especially thanks to my NDIP friends. I'm really thrilled to be here. So as Leslie mentioned, I have this unique position where I cross the sciences and the humanities. I have a joint appointment in the College of Information Studies and in the English department. So I approach Born Digital from at least 2 perspectives. That is, I'm a humanities researcher interested in studying and interpreting and creating creative and expressive content. But I'm also a digital preservation researcher, and I help preserve different kinds of works, but particularly video games and 3D virtual worlds. So I decided for tonight, one of the things I would do is first give you a sense of several current projects that illustrate that dual perspective. And then I'm going to spend the bulk of my time, about 15 minutes, covering some really great interview data that we gathered, that we collected as part of Preserving Virtual Worlds 2, which was funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services. We just wrapped up that project. Current projects. The first one was just funded. We got some seed money for a grant called Exploring Invisible Traces in Historic Recordings. This is with my colleagues Min Woo in electrical engineering and Doug Ord in the information school. We're building on Min Woo's research, where she's been able to, sounds like CSI stuff, but it's really not. She's been able to extract native fingerprints or native metadata from audio and video recordings. And what I mean by that is that there are natural fluctuations in the alternating current of the electrical grid that our recording devices automatically pick up and embed in our recordings subliminally without us really noticing them. But with the right tools, you can extract them and use those native signatures to geo and time code files. So you can imagine there are all kinds of forensic and legal contexts for this around authenticating when audio and video files were actually made. But we're interested in other things too. For example, how far back can we go in time to actually extract these signals? Can we go back to, if not the earliest cylinder recordings, which were produced by a mechanical process, not far after that? What happens as files are reformatted from one format to another, from analog to digital? And then we're using a case set around some of President Kennedy's recordings around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We don't exactly know, currently we don't exactly know when some of those recordings were made. We just have an approximate time period, and so we're going to see if we can nail some of that down. So a second project that I thought I would mention in passing is with another iSchool colleague. We started crawling congressional websites a few months ago using Archivit, the Internet Archive's web crawling service. And with my colleague, we want to develop some infrastructure for web archiving that will allow us to do more with work files and text mine them. I decided to mention this though as one particular challenge, because as we started doing this, there was, as some of you might have seen, a press release that came out around the Senate issuing some new restrictions on the NSF, the National Science Foundation, funding political science projects. In fact, the new restrictions are such that the NSF cannot fund them at all unless they relate directly to national security or the economy. The idea, of course, is that Congress does not want to be in the research spotlight. Imagine that. And so we are currently at a standstill here. We don't really know how to proceed because of the chilling environment. And we had actually hoped to go after some NSF funding for this. Then I teach in English a course called Book 2.0, The History of the Book and the Future of Reading. And one of the things that we've been doing a lot in that class is thinking about the future of the book through a lot of hands-on engagement and experimentation. And so one of the things the students have been doing is embedding microcontrollers in physical books. So microcontrollers are these very small computers, often 2 or 3 inches in diameter, that can give the analog world, the physical world, can endow them with interactive properties. And so what intrigues me about these books, this is one by one of my students, Cliffy Hickar. It's an artist's book. It's an altered book. She's sort of retelling Edward Lear's classic nonsense poem, The Owl and the Pussycat, with a lot of illustrations and watercolors. And she's embedded, as I said, microcontrollers in there to make some of the illustrations light up. So in this case, you see the microcontroller. She's actually sort of created a recess in the book to conceal the microcontrollers. And then you see on one side of the page some paper that's a kind of translucent paper, so that if you were to flip the page back over, there's an illustration on the other side, and it lights up and does various things with the LEDs that the microcontroller is controlling. So this is an example of an artifact that is neither born digital, nor digitized, nor completely paper-based. And so I think this represents an interesting new domain for digital preservation research. And then finally, I also work in the area of alternate reality games. I was funded by the National Science Foundation to develop an alternate reality game for K through 12 that we implemented in an Annapolis middle school in 2011. An alternate reality game is not a video game, and it's not augmented reality. It's a kind of a game that's told and played out across multiple media. So a player might, for example, purchase a book from Amazon, and that book can be read and enjoyed just like any other novel. But there will also be, for example, maybe an evidence pack in the book that it contains photographs, newspaper clippings, and then phone numbers to call and websites to visit. And in order to get the full experience of the game, you've got to branch out to all of these media and piece together all of the clues and help advance the storyline. And so as part of this, as part of our own game, we ended up creating a ton of artifacts, game-based artifacts. This is very typical for alternate reality games that are both analog and digital, and again, also contain a lot of microcontrollers. So there's a lot of the sort of physical-based computing aspect that we saw, that I just showed with the electronic, with the bibliocircuitry. So some of this is being exhibited in a couple of months at the Games Learning and Society Conference, and it's just another domain where you've this other sort of hybrid space where you've got a mix of analog, digital, and then these interesting artifacts that are neither analog nor digital, but both. So moving on to Preserving Virtual Worlds 2. This was a successor project to PVW1, which, as Leslie mentioned, was funded by NDIP. This project here we just wrapped up. It was funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services. It was a mix of both basic and applied research, but primarily basic research. Like PVW1, we adopted a case set approach. We had a total of 7 games in our case set. They were all nominally education-based games, although we really pushed the limit on what we mean by educational. So there are some classics and some famous ones like Oregon Trail and Super Mario Brothers, but we also snuck Doom in there, which is, of course, the classic first-person shooter, and I'm not even sure if we tried to make an educational argument around that one. And then my favorite, up in the upper right corner, Typing of the Dead, which was based on an earlier arcade game called House of the Dead 2. Essentially, the plot has you adopting the role of a secret agent, running around in an urban environment, trying to kill zombies. In the education-based version, Typing of the Dead, they redid the game or re-implemented it as an educational game that taught you how to type. And so instead of shooting these zombies with a gun, you are typing as quickly and as accurately as you can the words that appear above their heads. And as you can see, the secret agents no longer wield guns. They have keyboards strapped to them and laptop computers on the backs. So this was our case set. I won't go into detail about all of the deliverables. I'll just highlight maybe a few things. So a big interest of ours was studying and researching the significant properties of video games. So significant properties has emerged as a key term in the archival literature, and it's fairly self-descriptive. It refers to those properties of digital objects that are particularly salient or consequential. And the idea is that if you can identify those significant properties of your objects, you can adopt preservation strategies that will ensure that those properties survive over time, even if consequently you sacrifice others. That's the theory. In practice, I have to say, I don't think in practice that there has been as much uptake of this term as there has in the research literature, and that's one of the problems, actually. I thought I'd also point to a really interesting dimension of the project that was spearheaded by my colleague Henry Lowood at Stanford University. It's the last bullet point there. Methods for auditing the integrity of game software that involve testing the software's ability to play back demos, save state, or replay files. So taking Doom as his example, Henry was interested in the role of demo files, what are called demo files or lump files. Lump refers to their extension, .lmp extension, and how they might be used to, again, audit the integrity of various kinds of video games, and particularly Doom. So these are very interesting files that are they're recordings of a single gameplay session. Now, that's not a video recording. It is instead a kind of notation of gameplay that is both machine readable and, for the expert, human readable. And so to replay a demo file, you've got to use the same version of the game software that was used to create it in the first place. And so if you can effectively replay a demo file at some point in the future, successfully replay it, then you know that that file has been, or so that version of the game software has been successfully preserved. Versioning is very important. So for example, if you try to run a demo file in the wrong version of a particular game, in this case Doom, it's not that it won't replay, it will, but your player avatars will do things like run into walls or seem to shoot randomly rather than purposefully at targets and so forth. I mentioned significant properties. These are two very influential definitions of significant properties in the research literature. Those properties of digital objects that affect their quality, usability, rendering, and behavior. And then similarly, essential characteristics that must be preserved over time in order to ensure the continued accessibility, usability, and meaning of the objects. So if you're dealing with something like video games, significant properties might be things like sound effects or character levels or dialogue or narrative or cutscenes. And the way in which I just isolated some is very typical. They tend to be understood and articulated as sort of discrete properties. As part of PVW2, we interviewed something like 23 game developers, creators, or others who had a significant role in the creation of the video games in our case set. So these included people like Will Wright, creator of Sims and Spore and a bunch of other games, Sid Meier, the creative mind behind the Civilization franchise, Derek Paxton, who is famous for making one of the best and most popular mods to the Civilization franchise in its history. So a mod is a kind of user-based reimagining of the game. Claire Curtin, who else do I want to highlight here? John Romero, who's one of the masterminds behind Doom, and Larry Bond, Matt's favorite, Matt Kirschenbaum's favorite, who was responsible for Harpoon, a naval warfare game. Larry Bond was also a co-author with Tom Clancy of Red Storm Rising. I'm going to concentrate just on the interview data around the Civilization franchise because I had a direct role in that. I was involved in almost all of the interviews. And I'm specifically going to be, so the people we interviewed related to Civilization included Sid Meier, who co-created Civ 1 in 1991 with Bruce Shelley. He founded a game company called Microprose, which has since been superseded by Firaxis Games. It's a Maryland-based game company. And we basically interviewed every significant developer in Civilization's game development history. So Bruce Shelley, who was responsible for Civ 1, Brian Reynolds, the lead designer for Civ 2, Jeff Briggs, Civ 2, Soren Johnson, Civ 4, John Schaefer, Civ 5, and then Derek Paxton, who I just mentioned a moment ago, who was a player of the game, who created, again, one of the most consequential and popular mods called Fall from Heaven. And so I've actually coded using a social science analytics package called NVivo 3 of the interviews that I'll be concentrating on. And so those interviews are Brian Reynolds of Civ 2, Jeff Briggs of Civ 3, and Soren Johnson of Civ 4, and I'll be touching on some of the others a little bit. One of the ideas around this case set was working with games that exist in a series. So where multiple versions of the game have been developed for multiple platforms. Civilization was developed for the PC, for the Mac, and for various game consoles, and that exist and often exist in sequel form. And that's part of the original idea behind that, was that we were wondering what game developers did to manage the tension between continuity and change in the game franchise, what that might tell us about significant properties. In other words, are the most significant properties of the games those that remain intact as you develop new versions of the game? And so we thought we could get, base a series of interviews around some of that. All of our games, but have very complex genealogies, and Civ certainly falls in that category. And I should say that I'm not just talking about, when I say the genealogy, I'm not just talking about games that have the Civ name in their title. It's much more complicated than that. And I tried to create a little network that it's not really a genealogy. It's not so much a branching structure of modification and inheritance so much as a kind of jungle or rhizome. But just to sort of point out a few things, Civilization, the video game, was based in part on a pre-existing board game called Civilization, put out by Avalon Hill. It was also based in part on another video game called Empire that predated it. Civ 1 in turn spawned or helped inspire Rise of Nations, which was, I should say, Civilization, just to kind of, for those who don't know anything about the game, it's a turn-based strategy game created in 1991, where you build an empire that will withstand the test of time. So starting in 4000 BC, moving forward in time up to the near future. And you engage in, it's competitive, you're competing against other civilizations, you can adopt diplomatic strategies, more martial strategies, and so forth. So Civ 1 also spawned something called Rise of Nations, which was an attempt to reimagine at another game company by one of the original Civ designers, reimagine Civ not as a turn-based strategy game, but as a real-time strategy game. Civ 2 also in part inspired a game called Alpha Centauri, which was created by Electronic Arts, not by Firaxis. But interestingly, several of the designers that we interviewed of Civ claimed that Civ 3, which was a Firaxis game, was reused part of the code base of Alpha Centauri. So you have code base migrating across game companies in interesting ways. These were just some of the interview themes. There were something like 64 of them when I coded them. They include things like different game developers, the names of significant players, of significant creators, various concepts that emerged, and technical terms. And I don't know why this slide shows up like this, so dark like this, but it's just to sort of demonstrate that one of the most popular themes in all of the interviews was this one of continuity and change. The game developers had thought extensively about this problem. How do you honor the core characteristics of the original game while continuing to let it evolve? They all had different answers to the question of what are the most significant properties of the game. So I mentioned, I give you sort of the primary answer to each of the people that we interviewed. Sid Meier said it was a turn-based nature of the game. Jeff Briggs on Civ 3, it was the technology tree, which is this tree of innovations that you develop over the course of your civilization, things like writing systems, the wheel, pottery, spacecrafts, nuclear fission, and so forth. Brian Reynolds said the game mechanics. Soren Johnson said it was the tile-based nature of the game, not the turn-based nature, but the tile-based nature. John Schaefer said tile and turn-based nature of the game. And Derek Paxton said empire building. So no consensus, but each of them, when they explained their rationale, adopted a very similar strategy. And I'm going to highlight that with a quotation, part of which is here. This is from Soren Johnson. So Soren Johnson said it's the tile-based nature of Civ that is that most significant property. And I'll read it first and then I'll unpack it a little bit, because again, what he does in terms of rationalizing his choice is a tactic we saw across the interviews, regardless of what they chose. Well, I'd say that one of the key things for Civ is the tile-based nature of the game. Everything revolves around the tile. Most people first identify it as a turn-based game, and that's also important. But I think what's most important is that everything revolves around the tile. Your units are on specifically one tile. They're not somewhere in some sort of more analog space, less discrete space, which determines everything. It determines how units can move, who's adjacent to the city you are on, if you can build an improvement, if it's a good place for a farm, all these specific things. Everything flows out from the tile. Your culture grows one tile at a time. Your resources come from specific tiles. It's a very, very important thing. So the strategy that he uses that we saw again and again was that the developers would first definitely think about significant properties in terms of sort of decomposing the game into component parts or properties or characteristics. So thinking about properties discretely. But then when they described the importance of the characteristic, it was to show or demonstrate the cascade effects it had across the entire world of the game and across gameplay sort of viewed as a gestalt or viewed holistically. So they would sort of, I guess you could say the strategy was that they would identify a kind of master property that seemed to govern or to control everything else. So taking initially discrete properties, but showing essentially analog effects. I mentioned that they all had thought a great deal about managing the tension between continuity and change. There were a number of principles of change that emerged, and I want to highlight specifically in this list complexity, the 1/3 rule, and platform considerations. Complexity, this came up again and again. A number of the developers said that for this game and for other games, and maybe particularly the first-person shooter genre, but others, there is a tendency, if you're not careful as a developer, to skew the game more and more over time in the direction of what we sometimes call the lead players or the hardcore players, sacrificing the novice players or users. And that you would often sacrifice that sort of sweet spot in the middle. So they were all very conscious of that and had to sort of work sort of very consciously to mitigate against that. The platform considerations are also very interesting. This is the degree to which the game developers either tried to just sort of superimpose a game originally created for one platform onto a new platform, or whether they really tried to understand and honor and respect the affordances of the new platform. And so we have this wonderful quotation by one of the game developers. This is Brian Reynolds on Civ 2, talking about creating a version of the game for Windows. Most games up to this point had been done for MS-DOS as a platform. Certainly Civilization had, and almost every other game that Microprose had done. But we were starting to get that kind of antsy Windows is coming feeling. And so we decided that to do Civ 2 as a Windows game. Windows 3.1 was the last one that kind of ran on top of DOS. You'd boot up DOS, and then you'd tell Windows to load, and then you could be in Windows. And so it was kind of an early phase of even doing games for Windows. And one of the things that really worked out was the decision to really embrace Windows in the new version of the game. There was a lot of resistance to the operating system in general because everyone wanted to have their super fancy, graphic-y whatever, and they would take over the full screen. That was the thing. But we not only didn't do that, we actually kind of went for Windows in the sense that if you play Civ 2, you can actually not only size the window of the game, but you can subsize the smaller windows and all of that stuff. So we kind of just said, oh, we're making the game for Windows, so let's just own it and really make a game for Windows. And that paid huge dividends when Windows 95 came out because it became the dominant operating system. So we really picked the right platform at the right time. And at the same time, we leaned into the platform, there's my title, rather than a lot of the games that were kind of leaning away. I think that the really surprising magnitude of the success of Civ 2 has a lot to do with the fact that it wasn't just fun and polished, is it was also that it really leaned hard into that platform at a really good time. And so yes, platform is very significant, and the choice of platform and market timing were very significant. I mentioned the 1/3 rule. This was a kind of formulaic response or strategy to managing continuity and change that at least 3 of our interviewees mentioned independently of one another without being prompted. And this was directly in answer to the question, how do you manage the balance between tradition and innovation in the development of the franchise that is being true to the original while still changing and evolving? So here's Soren Johnson again. There's this other phrase we use that originates from Bing Gordon, that a good sequel should be 1/3 old, 1/3 improved, and 1/3 new. You know, where you're kind of looking for this nice mix of stuff people are going to be very familiar with, stuff that you weren't happy with before, so you're going to change, and then sort of the big bullets that are going to be on the box. These are the new things. For Civ 4, the new things were stuff like religions and great people and promotions. This is actually one of the most interesting parts of the project to me. Almost all of the definitions of significant property in the research literature emphasize visible surface characteristics. So I ticked off some that people might mention in response to games, things like character levels, sound effects, dialogue, look and feel type of things. But for games, and probably with other artifacts, surface visible characteristics aren't enough. You need to be able to get at the underlying data structures and game model and physics engine. And there was a whole range of data that we got that sort of spoke to this. A lot of players do things with, like, for example, called speed runs, which is where you try to make it through a single game session as quickly as possible. Either an entire game session or a particular level, and you're competing against other players to see how fast you can do this. Players exploit glitches in the game, things that shouldn't be there, or anomalies in the underlying physics engine in order to do this. So they'll do things like run or walk diagonally across walls. You shouldn't really be able to do that. They exploit the glitches. There's a really famous piece by a gamer of a player of a first-person shooter game called Quake, called Zigzagging Through a Strange Universe or something like that. And he calls what he does Physics 101, where you're probing the underlying game model as a player, trying to understand how it works. When we interviewed Don Rawich of Oregon Trail, he repeatedly made the same point, that what made the simulation of Oregon Trail so interesting was the underlying game model, where he really researched original settlers' diaries to understand how settlers died along the Oregon Trail in the 19th century from Missouri to Oregon. I mean, he tried to get the probabilities right in the game. In other words, how often would settlers die of dysentery or typhoid or by being killed by wild animals or whatever? And he specifically mentioned players who would, for example, do things like intentionally play passively and try to go as long as possible without buying provisions. And he called this probing the underlying game model. And so players do this all the time. We asked our developers, were there any ways in which they tried to surface those game properties, make them visible at the player level? And they all had interesting things to say about this. How am I doing on time, Leslie? Okay. So I'm going to read, if I can identify the right one. I'm going to read a quotation that speaks to this from Civ. Soren Johnson again, who had the best quotes. Generally speaking, we found that the more explicit you are, the better players respond to it. So this is all about the game model, which is normally invisible, how they're making it visible to the player. And I don't think it's necessarily true for every game, but for us it's very true because Civ kind of feels like essentially a board game inside your computer. The type of board game that would be fun to play, but impossible logistically to do in the real world. You're using your computer to help you run it. A good example of this would be diplomacy. So Civ is a single player game. And so one of the interesting ripples of that is how do you do diplomatic AI, artificial intelligence? How do you decide what the enemy civilizations are going to do? You know, are they going to declare war? Are they going to be your friend? How aggressive are they going to be? How easy are they going to be to trade with? And so on and so forth. And you know, that's really kind of a very subjective question. The Civ series has gone back and forth with this question a lot. So with Civ 4, one of the things we did that was a little different is that when you went into the diplomacy window, when you moused over the leader's head, it would literally give you the mathematical breakdown of all of the factors that made them like you or dislike you, right? +2 if you shared the same religion, -3 if you invaded them in the past, -1 if we share our borders, +4 if we had a trade agreement. This gave players a very tangible sense of why a civilization likes them or dislikes them, and what they could do to change that. So this was initially the sort of algorithms that dictated how the game engine would respond to these things was initially, of course, invisible, and they decided to make it very explicit to the gamer community. When they then tried to take it out of the game again, there was an uproar from the player community who demanded that they restore it. Interestingly, Sid Meier was the only developer of the Civ franchise who contradicted this line of thinking. He thought you never want to surface this kind of information, that it destroys the suspension of disbelief, of course. But he was a sort of outlier voice among the developers. And I'll skip that. I'll end by just covering a few implications for collection development. And so I think one takeaway is that any particular title manifests complex genealogies of which the curator should be aware, and recognition of such familiar relationships might be used to guide collection policy. And then finally, the implications for preservation. I won't go over all of these, I'll just highlight a few. But obviously, the idea behind the interviews was that understanding development history and roles can help guide preservation actions and strategies. Another is that users care about the underlying game structures and models, and making them visible, accessible, and manipulable aids in long-term preservation. That promoting reuse is a form of preservation. And I quoted Bethany Novisky here, "The used key is always bright." This is from a keynote that she gave at the Rare Books and Manuscripts Conference in 2012, I think. And this is the part of the quotation from Bethany. "In contrast to physical documents and artifacts, or the best preserved specimens are the ones that time and good housekeeping forgot, the more a digital object is handled and manipulated and shared and even kicked around, the longer it will endure. The harder they work, the longer they last." And certainly we saw that Civ, at later stages in the franchise, made it very easy for game players to mod the game, to sort of take the game in new directions. And this new generations remake the game to make it relevant for their own time. So I would say that was another takeaway, and I'll go ahead and wrap it up there. Thanks. And happy to take questions. Yeah, Susan, hi.
Did you or are you considering doing a comparable level of interview with a set of players of Civilization?
We did not. The only one that we did for Civ was Derek Paxton, and I think yes, ideally we should, and we didn't. I don't think we did. I think almost all 23 except for Derek Paxton were developers. But ideally, yeah, it would be great to have that perspective as well. And one of the things that we did do was we created a player questionnaire. In other words, when you're thinking about preservation strategies, we created different questionnaires for different stakeholders, including developers, players, and curators. So we did think about that. But no, we don't have interview data on that, but that's a great point. Any other questions? Yeah.
Not a question, but a comment, and it has to do with significant properties and the despair that those of us in the archiving community
Yes.
Around that term.
Yes.
And I'm interested in what you said about the gaming procedures, because an example I think of, and again, we have to deal with millions of these, is an HTML file that renders very differently in different browsers.
Mm-hmm.
What is canonical rendering?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it depends, and it's called the intentional fallacy.
Yes.
In literature long ago.
Yes. Yes.
It creates huge problems daily.
It creates huge problems, and I think one thing that tends to happen in the research literature is that there's this embracing of the idea of significant properties. That in turn implies that there is such a thing as insignificant properties. But when you pose that question to the different, to particularly archivists and curators, you hear crickets. They have tons to say about significant properties, which are all about minute material properties. They'll say, in games, they say everything's important. All of the hardware is important. The kind of input device you're using is important. But no one is ever willing to go on the record to say what those insignificant properties might be. And I think, your example is a great point. And I have to say, I don't feel that much closer to answering the question. I think the key is determining a designated user community as the OAS model specifies, and you use that community in its perspective to help you adjudicate those decisions. Thank you. Thanks.
We want to thank everyone for coming, thank everyone for staying a little bit late tonight, and please come back for some of our other Preservation Week events. We have some going on, every day this week, ranging from working with digital scrapbooks to learning about digital imaging and preserving your digital photos, to every aspect of personal digital archiving. So please come back to the library, and we look forward to seeing you later in the week. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.